Hi, can you hear me? All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to use the map room, but no luck, unfortunately.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Music Forward, a conversation about social emotional learning. This is the first installment of a new series hosted by Education Through Music, designed to bring together leading experts to discuss how music and music education is moving forward. My name is Stephanie Nantel. I am the Assistant Program Director here at Education Through Music in New York. Today's session will be about 60 minutes long, with room for Q&A for the final 20 minutes. Please enter your questions using the Q&A feature in this webinar. This conversation will be recorded and available following the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenters. We have Dr. Scott Edgar. He's an internationally sought after clinician on the topic of social and emotional learning, Associate Professor of Music, Music Education Chair, and Director of Bands at Lake Forest College, and the author of Music Education and Social Emotional Learning, The Heart of Teaching Music. David Zuckman is a songwriter and producer, managing partner of Tulare Capital Management, and co-founder of the We Are All Music Foundation. Dr. Alice M. Hammel is a widely known music educator, author, and clinician. She teaches for James Madison University and around the country in residencies, workshops, and seminars. She is a leading scholar in the area of students with special needs. Leah Thakur is in her fourth year of teaching music in New York City public schools. She has been with ETM for 4 years, and she has taught in 5 different New York City public schools in the boroughs of Staten Island and the Bronx. Leah has recently graduated with her master's degree in music education from Teachers College of Columbia University. And our host for this evening's discussion will be ETM board member and program committee chair, Manoj Susarla. And without further ado, I will kick it off.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to all of our thank you to all of our panelists for your time, and thank you for the audience for joining. I do want to just say this has been an incredibly difficult year in education broadly, but music education specifically, and I do want to tip my hat to our instructional supervisors, so all of the hard work they've done. As the chair of the programs committee, I get to see firsthand everything that they do, and they have handled everything this year with aplomb. It's just it is really amazing. So we are in good space today. So without further ado, let's get started. Recognize that, I know that a lot of people on this panel or in the audience who have different levels of fluency with what SEL means. So let's start with a very basic question before we even get to music education. What does SEL mean to us? So Scott, you literally wrote the book on this. So if we could start with you, that'd be great.
First of all, thank you to ETM. Such an honor to be here. And Manoj, just such a great question to get us started, because I think oftentimes that's exactly how we see it implemented in schools. We see it as something that is broad. We see it as something that people don't have a common definition of how we approach it. And so many teachers are saying, oh, that's great, but what does it look like in my world? So broadly, social and emotional learning is a construct that helps us, as teachers, as adults, students, start to navigate this world around us, help us to be a little bit more self-aware, be a little bit more socially aware, and in the end, well, just make quality decisions. We have redefined this over the last 26 years. So social and emotional learning has been around for 26 years. And I think oftentimes people think, oh, it's a buzzword. I'm going to spend a lot of time working on it, and next year it's going to be something else. Well, 26 years we've built the research, the policy, and the practice, and it's not going anywhere. So at its heart, social and emotional learning provides teachers the ability to work with their students to build skills that are going to translate to help them confront life challenges, or as we like to think of it, the tests of life. And schools oftentimes focus more on a life of tests than the tests of life. So we think about those challenges that this last year, Manoj, as you said, that have been almost insurmountable for many. It helps us understand our emotions, to be able to manage them, to articulate them, to appreciate diversity, to understand that if we're going to get through this, we're going to get through this together. And then to realize that my decisions have meaning and can affect change both in my classroom, in my school, and in my community around me.
And Alice, if I can turn to you, please. How would you overlay that? I know your specialty is working with children with special needs. How do you think about SEL in that context?
Okay. I was a fan of SEL prior to having a heuristic and vocabulary and language to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
I have been teaching for 35 years and have taught my little ones how to recognize and understand the feelings that they're having and to modulate them if and when they're able. Sometimes that's a process, particularly with students who have disabilities that affect their behaviors and emotions. So the first step is we kind of recognize, how we're feeling, right? Can we verbalize that, or can we in some way communicate it in another way for my students who are not currently verbal? The next way is the next step is, can I really understand the feelings and emotions of someone else?
Mm-hmm.
So when two of my little ones get into an altercation, it's, yes, but can you understand how Scott felt about that and what Scott might be feeling right now? So we work on that. And again, it takes quite a bit of time for students who already struggle in these areas. And then the third step for me is, how can I change a little bit what I'm doing, and how maybe can my friend change what they're doing so that we can coexist a little better? And that takes a long time too. But when I can get my students to be able to understand their feelings, the feelings of others, and how those all kind of work together, I think we've done very well.
I agree. No disagreement there. David, if I can turn to you, from a slightly different perspective, how do you incorporate SEL into your considerations from a fundraising perspective?
Sure, it's a great question, and we've had some already compelling descriptions about it so far. And thanks for ETM for having me here. The We Are All Music Foundation was founded to be a central voice for music nonprofits that are, focusing on social causes in education, health and wellness in underserved communities. And these nonprofits are using the power of music to effectuate that change. When you're looking at music and the arts, it is less binary, less right or wrong answer, like when you look at math. And we think that is a perfect environment to have social emotional learning. And I think that when we looked at the 270 applications or more than that for our grants this past fall, and we had to discern really who quantified the data, who qualified the data, who was able to really communicate the impact of what they were doing on people's lives. A lot of it came down to understanding and quantifying that social emotional impact. It wasn't just binary. It wasn't just right or wrong. And I think we're seeing that some organizations have really embraced this and are quantifying it in ways they haven't done before, embracing technologies and sort of more systems and things internally, creating learning modules, incorporating it into training, and doing other things, which we'll talk about throughout the evening. But it's really also it's the how. It's not just enough to just say that this is being empathetic, but it's who is best really at developing relationships, right? It's actually putting into practice either the mentor-mentee relationships or creating a bond where it can be learned, and it's more the how, not just the what. So I'll leave it like that, and hopefully we'll expand on it throughout the conversation.
You're beating me to my second question, which we'll get to in a minute, but I do want to ask Leah, first of all, congratulations. As of a few weeks ago, you got your master's degree. Wonderful. Congratulations. Practically, as a practitioner, what does this mean to you?
I think SEL is one of the most important things you can incorporate into your music classroom. We want our classrooms, especially music, to be a place that's fun and a place that's full of deep learning and collaboration and discovery. And a lot of that work is really vulnerable, especially for your elementary students, and especially as they're getting into the upper grades and they're doing a lot of firsts. Maybe they're composing for the first time or singing in front of people for the first time. Maybe they're listening to music that they've never heard before. Maybe they're listening to music that they really love, and they're not entirely sure how they want to share that. So we're asking a lot of our students. Um, and so in order to do that, you like SEL is something that you really need to incorporate and help them, as everyone else has been saying, with discovering their emotions and how to express that and how to work with other people so that they can be discovering new things and collaborative.
And I, for one, I went to public school in upstate New York, and I had, clapping for credit since kindergarten, and I just took that for granted that I thought everybody did, but no. And music education definitely imparted a huge SEL component to me, and I'm very thankful for having that opportunity. So we've discussed SEL in a broad context, music agnostic. Let's zero in a little bit more now, focusing on music. Um, so, so Scott, again, if we can start with you, what makes music and music education a good medium for SEL?
Yeah, well, I believe it's the perfect medium. And I would also expect and hope that every single content teacher in schools would say that their content is the perfect medium. I'm just biased because I'm a musician, but I want everyone to believe that their space is the right space for SEL. Now, we'll unpack the unique elements of music in just a second, but we have just profound, building on the shoulders of profound research that says that what we call a bolt-on program. So if we take SEL and we put it the first 15 minutes of every day, advisory, not linked to curriculum, not linked to the relationships that we build in the classroom, it doesn't go so well. That's why music starts to hit a home run on this. We see our students year after year. When I was teaching K-12, 8 straight years that I saw my students develop from little ones to semi-mature young adults, and that's what we embraced. We had that developmental relationship. And then as we're engaging with music, so many life experiences are embedded in that. Let's not lie to ourselves that this fall we're going to be embarking on a mental health crisis. And the students who so choose to engage with music, which I believe we need to have a targeted effort to engage more students in music, but the students who so choose and have that identity in our space, we are going to be one of their key assets to getting them through that mental health crisis. Because of that connection, the arts, music especially, is emotional. It is social. We come together and do this. But I don't believe that we as music teachers already do this. I believe that this is something that needs to be intentional, that our teachers need to say this is something that we value, that this is the heart of teaching music, and we're doing this work together with our students. It needs to be embedded so that we don't know where the music stops and the SEL begins, and it needs to be sustained. It cannot be 15 minutes on Friday. It needs to be part of everything we do. So, many people right now are starting to think, okay, so what does this look like in music? So the first thing that I'm going to suggest is that I'll throw another buzzword at you, because let's just admit SEL is a buzzword right now, and I think that's a really good thing that we should embrace now. Resilience. We're trying to teach our students to overcome challenges. Well, you can't do music without being resilient. If you sight read a piece perfectly the first time, it's too easy. Well, you got to be resilient. You got to find those road bumps, and you got to keep on going. It's all about, Leah, you said the word vulnerable. You cannot have meaningful music without being vulnerable. We have to put ourselves out there. That's why music. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do right now is to celebrate our cultural assets, understanding that it is not just us, that we're coming together in a space where everybody brings something meaningful to the table. And what that means is oftentimes in SEL, the teacher needs to take a step back and the students need to take a step forward. And, I think oftentimes the most powerful phrase that we've heard this last year is, hey, you're on mute. We often mute our students. And what we need to do is unmute our students. And teachers aren't always comfortable with that. So last thing I'll say before we move into, and I'll gladly pass, is that the most powerful thing we can do is one, help our students set their own goals. Oftentimes they acquiesce to our goals, and that's what they're used to. So can we engage our students in our space to set their own goals? And can we give them space to self-assess, that we're not the only ones giving grades? So David, absolutely, totally understand this idea of, whenever we're going to do anything, we need to see if it's successful. I think the number one most powerful tool that we have to assess whether SEL is working in our classrooms, our students' voices.
And Leah, how have you found that balance? On the one hand, you want to impart education, but on the other hand, to Scott's point, sometimes the teacher does need to let the student move a little ahead, and particularly in this year more than ever. How have you found that balance? And Stephanie, same question for you.
It is difficult, but it's definitely possible. There are just going to be some days where you just have to attend to your students' needs. They're not going to learn anything unless they know that there's someone there who loves them and that they are as safe as possible. So if you have to spend the entire class period talking, listening, especially listening, because some kids just want to be heard and some kids just need to be heard. If that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. That's not every day, or else we would never get to any of our content or ever finish our curriculum, which is important, and the kids do enjoy learning it. But there are just some days that you have to do that. And then in your regular planning, just as you're planning lessons, think of SEL activities to put in there, whether it's a minute or two of meditation to some music, or listening to music and asking the kids how it makes them feel, just asking them how they are that day. Maybe it's a lesson. I did a lesson once around election time, I think. We were talking about the election and talking about how maybe you feel a little powerless as someone who can't vote quite yet and doesn't really know what's going on, but you as yourself, and you and your thoughts and your views of the world and who you are, even as a child, like you are a superhero and you can change the world. And so we wrote like little superhero songs on Google Chrome Music Lab. So it's finding balance. Sometimes that's it. That's just what you're doing. It is an SEL day. You just need to love on the children. And I like to also incorporate some student-led SEL, like meditation. I'll usually start that at the beginning of the school year so they kind of have an idea what's going on, but then I'll have the students run the meditation for however long they feel like they want to that day. But yeah, so incorporating it just into your regular lesson planning, but sometimes you just have to do what you have to do.
And Stephanie, if I can pose a related question to you, as an instructional supervisor, how is your design of curriculum when you work with teachers? How has that been impacted by SEL, by everything we do?
Absolutely. Well, I get to work with an amazing, very talented team of instructional supervisors. And at the start of this year, they started working on unit plans that integrated social emotional learning benchmark standards into the plans. So we're not focused just on teaching music. We're not focused just on teaching beat, but we're thinking about larger essential questions and how these music concepts can help us get towards understanding those social emotional things, those things about ourselves and each other. They also worked in social justice standards and benchmarks. So we're thinking very big picture. And so the scope, and that's a way of teaching culturally responsive teaching, and that you're finding a way that meets all students authentically, instead of just saying, this is the way that we're going to learn beat. Everyone's going to do it this way. It happens with this song. Here we go. So we're definitely working towards that more. That's a big initiative we're pushing this year as well. We want to think back as we go into our classrooms. We're calling our training this year Back to Basics, because we're starting from scratch, really. We've all gone through a lot in the last year. And students need to be welcomed back into that space. They need to feel comfortable. They need to feel safe, but they need to know what the boundaries are and what the expectations are. And we want to do that in a way that's really authentic to that music room, authentic to that teacher, in a way that makes those students feel safe and comfortable and able to engage. So SEL is more than just how we interact with music. It's more than what we put in our lesson plans, but it's really how we operate and function in that music space. It's a really special place.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And again, as I was saying before, everybody remembers their kindergarten teacher and their first grade teacher, but you only have them for 1 year. Your music teacher you have for many, many years. I still remember my orchestra teacher, my choir teacher, and just what they imparted on me beyond music was incredible. I'm so thankful to them for everything they've done. So we've talked SEL, we've overlaid music in SEL. Now we started talking about it. Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. Clearly, this has been a harrowing year for parents and children alike. And again, the aplomb with which our ETM teachers have handled this is beyond amazing. But let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. David, you had a great article in Forbes, and you quoted a bunch of stats about the effect the pandemic has had on children. Can you talk through a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I guess it was back in late March now that Forbes came to us and wanted to understand a little bit more about how well, music could improve some of these statistics that we were seeing on anxiety, on depression, on the impact on the elderly, all sorts of things. And the data actually came from a group called Prosper that provides monthly information to Forbes, which we comment. So we didn't mine the data, importantly. That said, there were some amazing things. Like traditionally pre-pandemic, you saw 8.5% of respondents say that they were experiencing some signs of anxiety or depression, and the number once the pandemic was maybe 4 or 5 months in was 23%. So that was a massive jump, right? Mm-hmm. Probably the closest thing to loneliness or being closed off that you had from a case study perspective was a lot of the elderly in nursing homes. And now we sort of saw and got to experience that in many ways across the whole globe. And everyone experiencing it obviously differently, but you now have out of this pandemic lots of experiential data on that aspect of things, right? And it all came back to whether it was music for the elderly in the nursing homes, and the same type of things that had been used pre-pandemic used now more broadly for everybody. So we saw that music could really make a big impact. And we try to convey that in the Forbes article. I also, want to comment briefly on what you said about in the previous question about the music teachers and people having an influence, right? Because more than ever during the pandemic, the music teacher was like right there over Zoom or in the home, right? You sort of were. It wasn't just in the school; it was in the home. It was with the parents. It was a whole family affair. Okay, and that you got some interesting perspectives in looking and trying to integrate. It almost became a different environment that people had to adapt to with social emotional learning, right? So when I remember when I was, I don't know, I guess 13 or something like that, and to me, it must have stuck with me. It's 13, right? And I was on stage with my saxophone and my band teacher. We're all about to play our first note, and tons go up, and he looks to everybody and he says, "Are you nervous?" To us, not to the audience. "Are you nervous?" And I said, we all were like, "Yeah." We're like, "That means that you care." And then we started, right? And it was like, and I remember that to this day. And I go into major business meetings. We look at not just playing music, but and I'm like, "You nervous?" Because you care, right? And it's those singular moments which are so profound in music, as you mentioned, challenge, and you mentioned perseverance and life lessons that are so incorporated. And so I think going back to the Forbes article, we have this environment where more than ever, you saw just huge spikes in the type of things that music is so known to adapt to, or provide an environment that helps. And I don't know if anyone else wants to expand upon that.
Well, Alice, if I can put that question to you, you've already focused on children with special needs. If we overlay the pandemic into this discussion, how is that? How has that changed your consideration, your approach to children with special needs?
Before the pandemic started, many students who are moderately to severely affected by their disabilities live life according to a very specific, if not strict, schedule. They had, this is when I get up, this is when I do this is when I go to school. And of course, the school day was very structured, in particular, if they utilize a self-contained setting for their instruction, then they would come home and often would have a very schedule, their schedule was set. So March 13th, thereabouts, 2020, their whole lives changed. And all of a sudden there was no school, there were no therapies, there was no best buddies, there were no community activities, there was nothing. And it was just the child at home. Many students who live life at this level of disability are not able to independently work a computer. They can't go and log on to the Zoom class unless somebody is there to do it for them or with them. These are students that often have paraprofessionals or teachers' assistants at school, and all of a sudden that's gone. A lot of them experienced great trauma in having their schedule upended that way and not having those same experiences. A lot of the families then experienced great trauma through either a job loss or being diagnosed with COVID, or trying to figure out how to be home to take care of the child that's usually at school. It has been really difficult. I've counseled many music teachers during this time as to what to do to try to reach those students. And I talked a lot, just as Leah said, you still need to develop a relationship with that child. If they don't know that you care about them, they won't do much for you, really. I mean,
Yeah, and Leah, can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, not to put you on the spot, but Alice, the word upended is exactly the right characterization of what so many children have gone through. And again, I keep singing your praises. You are the unsung heroes, the teachers. Can you speak a little bit to what you've been going through?
Yeah, it's been hard going through this pandemic as an adult. So think about that, and then think about being 8 or being 5 or starting kindergarten, starting school for the first time and never going to your school building. Like, think about how difficult that has been for children this whole time. And I've had students that told their friends to come to the 5th grade celebration because they haven't seen them in a year and a half. Imagine being 10 and not seeing your best friends for so long. It's been really, really hard. And it's been hard to engage students and figure out a way to make them want to come to class when they're dealing with life. I mean, they're dealing with life in general before the pandemic, and it was hard for a lot of students in a lot of different ways to begin with. And then you added this on top of it. It's been really difficult. But there's also been some blessings in there, because now I do get little siblings that come to my music class. I get like 3-year-olds showing up with their 5-year-olds in kindergarten. That's been great. I have parents that come to music class sometimes. And so you do get to build a virtual community in a new way that we didn't really have before. But at the same time, being virtual all the time, or seeing some of your friends are in the school building and you're still at home, or all of those things, it's been a lot. It's been very difficult.
And particularly in a place like New York, small editorial comment. I have 2 nieces who live in Seattle, and so their school got closed down, but they at least had each other. Whereas my neighbors down the hall, they have 1 kid, and yeah, it's been really tough for her just to feel isolated like that. So yeah, that loss of continuity is it's particularly difficult. So again, kudos to all of you for what you do.
Manoj, can I jump in? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. I just wanted to shine a brief light again on our teachers and what they've gone through to be able to meet the needs of their students. New York City schools have been in person and remote for this entire school year, one of the few major school districts to do that. And so, Leah, without putting you on the spot too much, about how many times this year, Leah, did you have to quarantine because you were potentially exposed to COVID?
I had to quarantine 6 times.
6.
So yeah, 6 times I had to quarantine, and school buildings shut down There was January, I did not go to school. My school shut down for 2 weeks, and then I quarantined. Went back for like a day, and then I quarantined for 2 weeks. And that's also difficult to go back and forth between school and to go back and forth between home. Your teacher's in school this week, and now the next week she's quarantined. I also teach a marching band out on Long Island. I didn't do the spring season because I didn't want to commit to going out to all those rehearsals and then not be able to go for 2 weeks because I had to quarantine. And so, I mean, there's rapport there that I now have to rebuild later on because things are starting to look up. But yeah.
Turning back to the funding side of it, David. There's clearly been a sea change, in a good way, that there's an important stress on SEL now. And you talked about this a little bit, but can you go a little further into how do you affect change? I mean, it's one thing to raise funds, but how do you affect change at the school level, with policymakers, with principals? Leah mentioned that 6 times she was quarantined. The New York City public school system has gone through a ton of stuff, and Carranza left. We got a new DOE head, so that was in the middle of all of this. David, how do you think about all of that? How does that impact your approach to fundraising?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind.
Sorry, if I may.
Sure.
How do you go beyond just it's one thing to allocate capital, but how do you affect change? How do you make sure that the capital that you're allocating is going the way you want it to go?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked that, because there are 2 things that we're focused on. So I mentioned the one that we're focused on being a central voice, providing best practices and really raising awareness for the entire music for social cause category, right? So one, we think we're every day expanding our distribution. More and more corporations want to support a social charity that actually has an impact, where you can provide the data and the science behind that impact. And so we are trying to shine a spotlight on those that are doing their very best on the ground, like education through music. That's the first thing, to really use our platform to shine a spotlight. The second thing is we are and have been in the process of creating a research group, which is really going to have a leading central depository for research, for studies, for data that will be accessible to everybody across the charitable organizations that can leverage the data to kind of understand impact and make it clear to their constituents, and also to corporations and to donors to better understand what is the impact here, right? You'd be surprised just how many people don't understand very clearly as if it was food or water or shelter, right? People think about food, water, shelter, and they look at it as essential, and they look at music and the arts as a nice to have, not a need to have. But what SEL does is it turns music into a need to have. Okay, and it's as simple as that. And and you need the depository of research and the emphasis on data to be able to explain music in that need to have terms, in terms of impacting lives. And once you do, you're able to bring people in at a much, much, much higher level. We believe that the market today for these social causes that are affected by music is only $250 million across the country, and other causes that are more essential are in the billions. There's no reason that we can't grow this category from 250 million into much higher than that, if we're able to translate it in terms of essential and translate it in terms of need to have. I think SEL is one way to do that. There are also increasing technologies and technology companies that we're partnering with to do what you all have discussed, which is you have to measure the data. It's not just, you get it from the kids, right? We've talked about that, but you got to then ultimately be able to quantify it, aggregate it, measure it, and then translate it into changes, into roles and responsibilities at the teacher level, at the district level. One of the things but we see oftentimes, and I've been talking to a lot of people about this in the last few months, is that because SEL has become a buzzword, you're getting schools that are embracing it, but they're saying, well, let's put a 30-minute SEL class at the beginning of the day. And what is that? Really, the concepts of SEL need to be incorporated. It's actually the easiest to incorporate it into music areas because it's just a natural environment to incorporate it in, but it also needs to be incorporated into the sciences and the maths and how you're dealing with children throughout the overall learning process, right? So we're much more a fan of an integrated approach. So when we look at someone like Education Through Music and their training modules and the way that they approach SEL at the training and the teacher level, and we know what type of communication that's going back into the schools, that's great. So we are really here to vet best-in-class charitable organizations, and then give the money to the ones we think are on the boots on the have the boots on the ground to really make a change. Over time, we would love to also give larger sums and also develop co-initiatives with those charitable organizations that are aimed at doing these type of projects that change lives and create change. And so to the extent that charitable organizations are looking for a group to fund greater data collection, greater SEL evaluation, and training modules, and anything that we think is in this realm, it's an area where co-developing initiatives or projects around this is something that we're a big fan of.
Yeah, and I do want to ask the question of Leah and Stephanie, boots on the ground, but Scott and Alice, from an academic perspective, how do you think about the KPIs to measure the effectiveness, the efficacy of SEL?
Okay, I'll speak first since I didn't get to finish last time. I'll try to go first this time. Anytime you give a child with a non-standardized brain a standardized test, you will receive a response that is neither valid nor reliable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with my boots on the ground, because I also teach children every day myself, not just in academic. So as a teacher, I know that I look at my child when they come in the beginning of the year and develop a portfolio on all things, on all the different strands of music literacy and activity and everything they do, but also on their social emotional learning and what they're doing. And through the year, I've got artifacts that I include in that portfolio to continue to show their growth, including their own self-assessments of how they feel about things, how they feel they're doing, feeling their feelings, and then, how they manage that. And I think that is the way, especially if you're going to talk and work with the child who does not have a standardized or neurotypical brain, you're going to get valid and reliable results that way, much more reliable than you would through a standardized test that somebody who doesn't know the child made.
Before you chime in here, I just want to give a reminder to everyone that we have a Q&A feature available. So if you would like to present a Q&A question to the panelists, please go ahead and take that opportunity now. And sorry, Dr. Scott, go ahead.
No, not at all, Stephanie. And thank you so very much. I think that Alice just hit it out of the park. And I think that is absolutely critical. And everything that we need to talk about is how do we adapt. I think so many people are looking for that standardization, looking for the cut and paste. This is how you do SEL, and this is the practice that is going to elicit that result. And music is far too subjective for that. And social and emotional learning and humanity is far too subjective for that. But I'm not going to dodge the question, because we're doing some really great work at the Center for Arts Education and Social and Emotional Learning, a just launched group that is funded by ArtsEd New Jersey. And we're doing some really, really powerful work, taking the National Core Arts Standards and linking them with the CASEL 5 SEL standards of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. This is leaving the autonomy to the teacher, where the teacher is able to say, this is the area of SEL that I want to tackle. So Leah, can I put you on the spot? Can we do a little game here?
Sure.
Okay. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe what area, which National Core Arts standard you want to explore? Do you want to explore creation, performance, response, or connecting?
Let's explore connecting.
Great. And which SEL standard would you like to explore? Self awareness, self management, social awareness, relationship skills, or responsible decision making?
Let's do relationship skills.
Oh, what we all need right now. So we're going to go to connect and relationship skills. And what we've done when we get here is we have our anchor standards in terms of the arts. This is what our national core art standards say we need to unpack. Can we synthesize and relate knowledge and personal experiences to make art? Basically, can we put art into our work? Absolutely. And then down here, we've taken all of the subcompetencies of SEL, establish and maintain healthy relationships. So when we talk about key performance indicators, those two come together and we can dig a little deeper, and we have grade band competencies listed here. So let's say you teach the littles. Here's what it looks like in early elementary. Here's what it looks like in late elementary. Those are your key indicators. But what we've done, we've decided that that wasn't enough because that didn't translate it for music and the art. What we've done is built on a construct called understanding by design. We've then started to look at how can we make this universal for all students, zoom it out in a way that's going to answer some really powerful questions. So an enduring understanding, I kind of flippantly call this the so what. This is the big picture. This is what we're after. Artists explore, establish, maintain healthy relationships through camaraderie, safe space, and a sense of belonging and purpose. But when we look at what we're trying to look for in terms of data, it comes down to our outputs and our outcomes. Our outcome here needs to answer this question: how does connecting to the arts develop a positive communication and social skills? And then we work backwards. Do we figure out what practices we need to do in the classroom to elicit those data? And then once we get that data, then we're going to be able to measure the effectiveness of our implementation and our interventions. And this all goes back to how can we talk to our teachers? How can we think about what professional learning needs to occur so that the professional learning results in teacher change and results eventually, ultimately, not even eventually, ultimately in this idea of student empowerment, where the student's voice is heard above all, and the skill set is exemplified in our students.
So I think Scott definitely got Jonathan Hernandez's question about KPIs. Those are some real KPIs right there that can measure growth. Now that we've talked about student advocacy, I want to take Kath's question about teacher advocacy. Sorry. How can teachers advocate? They know that music is important. A music teacher, how they advocate that not only is music important for music's sake, but that it reaches these SEL needs to their administrators. I'm going to just throw that one out to the panel and see who wants to answer that one.
Okay. In my teaching, what has happened, and I have always taught I will only teach in situations where the students are at risk or in need. I just don't enjoy the other situations. What I found is, particularly when I started a school, is I'll get a class that maybe, some people would consider challenging. And through my SEL and through just the way I teach my lessons, sometimes after a few weeks, a month, that's the class where they'll all come together, and we don't have any talking that we shouldn't, like naughty talking, and we don't have any arguments, and we don't have any of that. Everybody just comes in. It's almost as if they just go, now I'm in music and I can let all that go, and I'm not mad at him anymore, and I'm not in a fight with her anymore. And just through doing it, you can show your administrators how what you're doing is different, and they can see, hey, something's going on in music that's not happening in other classrooms. So really, I mean, advocacy and talking about it is great, but doing it with your students and having people see it, I think, is the most important thing.
Stephanie, absolutely a great question. Alice, that advocacy in action, 100%. I also believe that it is a huge trickle down effect, that how administrators treat teachers is how teachers treat students. And adult SEL needs to be prioritized above all, almost first, so that we can help our teachers enter this fall with efficacy, with a sense not of dread, but with of optimism. And we know that teachers have been beaten up this last year, and summer is not going to heal that. The number one question that we need to ask for teachers is, what do you need this fall to be successful? For our students, what do our students need this fall to be successful? And then, with that being the end goal, we can then get to some of those meaningful pieces of how do you define success and how are you going to measure success?
And that leads us right into a question we came from one of our teachers, Jonathan Hernandez. What is the right lens for teachers who are navigating this rubric of SEL, of self-assessment, to make sure, that that they're imparting in the right way? What's the right lens for self-assessment from a teacher's perspective? How do you think about that? I'd love to hear Allison and Scott, and then Leah. How do you think about it? And Stephanie, in your work as an instructional supervisor, what is the right lens?
It's the lens of empathy. It's the lens of compassion. It's the lens of grace. It's the lens of us using this as a space to build relationships. Oftentimes people are thinking in terms of classroom management, thinking in rules. I'll take relationships over rules every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And one thing that we've stressed in the SEL community, and I think, Jonathan, this is the lens that we need to stress right now, is that, oftentimes we champion self-others decisions as the three large pillars of SEL. And I like that, but the problem with it is it really does position SEL as something that we plan and we do to our kiddos, as opposed to something that we need to do with our students, something that we design and implement, and our students are right there planning with us. So, that self piece, here's the lens, that self piece turns into identity. How can we unpack what is our identity? Where have we come from? And how does that impact our decisions that we make? That idea of others translates to belonging. Belonging is the space where we can come together and have vulnerability, and we can have trust, and we can have a space where we can make mistakes, and that perfection isn't the goal. David, I think it was you who said aptly that music is a space where there aren't right or wrong answers, but I think many of our teachers confuse that, and there are right or wrong answers. And the lens is leading with this idea that the right answer is driven from the students who are tinkering and envisioning what their own music education can look like. And then finally, this idea right along with that responsible decision making becomes agency. How can our students affect meaningful change? So it's that reframe from self-others to decisions to identity, belonging, and agency for us to start to implement some of these key performance indicators.
And Leah, how do you think about that? How do you think about self-assessment as someone in the field?
I think self-assessment is super important. I think, like, as a class, we are assessing each other. We come up with norms. So that is a way for us to plan goals together to assess, are we keeping up with our norms? Are we working as a community in that way? I think it's important for students to look at their own work and assess, like, did they put in all the effort? Did they do what they wanted to do? Did they accomplish what they wanted to do? Did they set a goal? Did we help them set a goal? Did they set a goal? Did they accomplish that goal? What steps do they need to take to continue accomplishing that goal? And then I just wanted to add a little more to what Dr. Edgar was saying, as we're using identity and belonging and all of those things as we are working with SEL and planning with our SEL. I think it's important to also always consider SEL in with a racial lens and with the socio-political context as well, because a lot of SEL, culturally responsive teaching, all of those buzzwords that are really important, so don't lose sight of that in the buzzword discussion, they're not all blanket activities or things. What's going to work for my students is going to be different from someone else's students when you think about their identities ethnically and racially and in gender and in sexuality and all of those things. So to keep those lenses in mind as we're thinking about SEL as well. And even another lens, and I'm sure Alice could talk more about that, ability. That is a whole other lens to keep in mind as you're planning and adjusting your SEL.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Leah, with everything. Right. You decide what are our class goals going to be? Who are we going to be together as a culture and a community? And then assessment. And I think it's important too, when you talk about self-assessment, you're assessing yourself. You're not assessing the person over there who you think didn't do the things. You're assessing yourself and how you did today. And yes, how that changes. And you're right, depending on what your identity is, what the intersections of all of your identities and who you are. So brilliant, Leah. That's
Leah and Dr. Alice just took the next panel question right out of us. It was, what is the intersection of culturally responsive teaching and social emotional learning? Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, just really quickly, everything that I just said about the reframe, that is something that has come from Castle and a lot of folks who are thinking about this as a response to injustice, and to realize that if we have a one size fits all definition of SEL in any context, that it doesn't work, that it needs to be a space that gives students the ability, the spaces to understand who they are, how they fit in, and how their voice can be amplified. Um, One of my favorite human beings on this planet is a general music teacher in California, and her name is Darlene Machacone. And she wrote a brilliant introduction looking at how her own identity played with SEL. And when she did some things that she thought were going to be culturally relevant or culturally responsive, it wasn't. And that's the point that we need to listen. Oftentimes, when we hit that point as teachers, like, okay, I give up, I'm scared. No, that's where two ears, one mouth, right? Okay, so we listen harder than we speak, and we hear what the students are bringing. That's that recognition of cultural assets. And finally, last thing I'll say is that we need to be courageous to have these conversations. We need to be courageous to open up our spaces. Even if we teach kindergarten, we can Mr. Rogers conversations about racism. We can Mr. Rogers conversations about gun violence. We can Mr. Rogers these conversations. And the constructs of social and emotional learning, this idea of identity, belonging, and agency. I just heard a beautiful quotation, and I'll finish this section with this. It's from Dr. Bettina Love, who is one of my all-time heroes, and she said, "If you are not talking about racism in your classroom, you are talking about racism in your classroom."
Wow, I wanted to leave a pause for that one. That's an amazing quote. We have been talking about SEL and how important it is, but what if I want to implement social emotional learning practices into my classroom or into my home? Can you all tell us tangibly, what would that look like? How could I do this with my family, with my child, with my students?
I could talk about this all day. I mean, this is exactly what we do. So cut me off when I start talking too long, because I want to, Leah, I am especially curious about what you do with your kiddos in the classroom. So I'm just going to give like two snippets of an idea and then tag your it, because that's what works, is what you've figured out that works. You know, especially when we're talking about this idea of the difference between behavior and culture. So behavior is the what that we do, culture is the how we do. I think a lot of the things that affect how SEL is implemented in our schools and in our homes is all about the how. How do we build this culture? So it might be as simple as looking out at your class and during a 30-minute class period, asking your students a ton of fist to fives. Okay, so how well do you think that lined up? How well did you get that rhythm? How well did you meet the objective that you set? Fist 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Here's a really quick activity, because you asked Stephanie about homes. And this is one that I just fell in love with early on the pandemic, because we need to connect. And it's called the musical family tree. Instead of putting pictures of grandma and grandpa, aunts and uncles, cousins, all the way down, how about we have our kids contact everyone in the family? And the one question you ask them is, what's your favorite song? Who's your favorite artist? What is a song that tells me who you are? And then we create a family tree, not of names and pictures, but of music. And then we have a musical identity of our families. Who's Glenn Miller? Who are the Rolling Stones? And then we start to work our way down and we realize, hey, could we make a playlist of this? And then we have our family's playlist of musical identity. So we're getting at the music, but we're also connecting our students, our kids back with their families, that socialization piece that we are so much longing for. So I'm going to shut up. Leah, tag.
Oh, I think that's a great idea. I think there's so many ways to incorporate this in the classroom. This year, especially since a lot of this has been online learning, using technology and all of that, I've really utilized Chrome Music Lab. And so not my idea. I got it off teacher Instagram. I'm being completely transparent. But at the beginning of the school year, we did an activity with the book, Your Name is a Song. And we got to read that whole book and talk about names. And one of my students was like, my cousin's name is a song, because their name was in the book. I was sobbing. I was like, it's beautiful. And then we wrote our name songs on Google Chrome Music Lab. And then I took it a step further and I had them ask, well, who gave you your name? Where does your name come from? What about your middle name? What about your last name? And we talked about that. We used a website called Typatone, where you type the letters and each letter has a note and it makes a whole song for you. So we had they took a really long time to play in class. So I will rethink that for next year. But we got to hear all these songs saying, my mom gave me my name and I was named after my aunt. And my middle name comes from here. And my last name is my dad's last name. And he is from Ghana. So it's a last name from Ghana. So things like that. With my older students, we've done a lot of social justice work in the classroom. And I think with them, it's a little easier to do this work because they're a little older, they understand things a little deeper. And after you've built the rapport to make it a safe enough space where they can do that work with you, SEL is you have to do social emotional skills during that, because those conversations get very heavy, especially if you're in a school like mine where I am Black, I'm a Black woman. Most of my students are also Black. If they're not, most of them are Latinos, Latinas, of all different races, right? And so that work gets very heavy. And so you have to work on the skills to make sure that they are understanding the emotions that they're feeling, especially when a lot of this is affecting them and their families. And their emotions, the emotions of other people in the classroom who are experiencing it in different ways. And how to have conversations like that, because it does get heavy, but it's important. So I like to use Padlet a lot for that and ask them just very broad questions through all of that, because this is not a space for me to talk about how I feel. It's a space for them to talk about how they feel. So very broad questioning, a lot of listening, and asking questions like that. I did another activity I got off teacher Instagram, not me. I did a very similar playlist activity at the beginning of the year where we did a playlist of me. So I had them pick their 6 favorite songs at the moment and tell me why they were their favorite songs. And then we got to talk about each other's favorite songs, learn some new things. They're interested in a lot of music that I'm now also interested in. Yeah, those are just things I can think of off the top of my head.
You're so brilliant, Leah. So I love hearing you.
Other teachers are brilliant and I borrow their ideas.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, that's what I say. Yeah, good teachers
question.
borrow, the best teachers steal. One thing I did as a parent, when it was very easy for me to get the question answered, how was school today? What'd you do at school today? Da, 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 until about middle school. And then it was a little more difficult. So I started asking them, what song do you like that describes your day or how you feel about how things went at school today? And at first, again, as Leah said, you have to practice these things. So at first I'd get, I don't know, and then I think eventually they started thinking about it during their day, right? What song, and say, okay, so what, and then as Leah said, I learned new music and I learned more of the music that my daughters were listening to, because they would name a song. And if I didn't know it, I'd go, I'd go listen to it and learn it. And eventually they were very facile at it. They said, well, mommy, what song describes your day? And we'd talk about what song describes their day. And it was kind of a way to remain in contact with them in a meaningful way that, right, were able to let me know musically how they were feeling and what had happened. So there's an activity.
Alice, you just jogged my memory. because it's so beautiful every night. This is a new thing. He came up with it. Yeah, he's our kid. But, at nighttime, when we're tucking Nathan into bed, we've started just having part of our nighttime routine saying, what's a good thing? What's the good thing that happened today and the bad thing that happened today? What's your favorite thing and least favorite? And just that act of those types of conversations, as you just said, Alice, whether we're teachers or parents, one of the actual, and this is counterintuitive, one of the worst things we can do from an SEL space is to go in and say, how you feeling? No one is going to answer that question well. We need to get sneaky. We need to get sneaky. We need to put the vegetables in the dish. So, what's a good thing that happened? What's a bad thing that happens? I get all the information that I want. And Nathan is starting to think about putting those things into categories, starting to think about why those things are happening. Alice, what I love that you do is, as always, you make it musical.
Yeah, that is great. I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but I do want to ask one last question. And if I can pose it in two parts, the future of SEL. So David, if we can start with you, again, from a fundraising perspective, what would you like to see? How would you like to see the incorporation of SEL move ahead?
Still think it's early days for SEL, and I think parents need to be as much as educated about it as teachers. I think the more the school districts are starting to hear the voices of the kids and the parents, talk about outcomes and impact, I think is important. I think that we've seen incredible work by the groups that we're funding. Education through music, one of the best in terms of just rising to the top, educating teachers, having those teachers incorporated into the classrooms. You're seeing, it's interesting, you're seeing, for example, that hip hop now is become like the language for the kids, right? It may not be my music every day, right? Although there's a good hip hop song here, there, right? But I think that recognizing that in many cases, in many underserved communities, hip hop is the language that children communicate with. And so we had a group, Hip Hop Public Health, that through the pandemic used hip hop songs and worked with educators to use that music to get out the word that vaccines were safe, that wash your hands for 20 seconds, and those messages reached 300 million people. So, and I don't think if hip hop was used, I think if it was like a public alert announcement, it wouldn't have reached that. So recognizing that music is the language of the youth. It is pop culture, and you can't not incorporate it into communication. Recognizing that is important. I think that, we're looking at like another group we funded, Guitars Over Guns, who has modules around the mentor-mentee relationship, right? It's not just an after-school program about music, but it's how to like incorporate life lessons, how to build confidence, right? Things that have been said on this panel embedded into it. So overall, we had another group in Connecticut, Music Haven, where it was not just about music, it became about food, and it became about assistance with rental income and assistance with just the things that they were going through during the pandemic, right? So the less we think about this as notes on a page or just, again, like, multiple choice, 1 through 5, how are you feeling, but really just about how it changes life and how students evolve and adapt with it, the more it becomes essential, effectively, the more we can push it out into the world and be effective. So the thing I was most shocked about is when I first talked to Education Through Music, and I said, well, what percentage of New York City schools have a music program, right? And it was really low compared to what I thought it could be. I mean, maybe it's high compared to other, but it was like astounding, right? And if you really believe that music is the best way to incorporate SEL, and SEL is so essential, how could you not have a music program? Right? So
Yeah.
all of a sudden, if you're trying to go sell music programs to principals and and they're comparing it to English and they're comparing it to other type of core curriculum, how could you not have a music program? It's a simple, right? So I think the more essential we make it, I'd like to really make it a must-have and not a
Nice to
a
have.
nice to have. Yeah.
Yeah. And Leah, great bridging point from a pedagogical perspective. What would you like to see in terms of the future of SEL, in terms of how it gets incorporated into your curriculum, how you as a teacher get trained in it? What would you like to see?
As for teacher training, I think we should start these conversations in undergraduate programs. I think a lot of music undergraduate programs need an overhaul in general for many things, but including things like SEL in undergraduate classes. You hear about it briefly towards the end as you're about to start student teaching, and then you're in the classroom. And then you're like, well, I need to like survive. So starting that conversation earlier, getting those programs and those classes into graduate programs as well, because you need a master's in New York State to keep up your license. So we all have to go back to school. We should be talking about SEL in our grad programs as well. And then the training. I'm I'm lucky that my principal is very passionate about SEL, and so we have had um, PDs on it before the pandemic. In the pandemic, I'm lucky that ETM has offered PDs on SEL, so I've gotten a lot of training since leaving school. But I don't necessarily think that that's the norm. So I think that teacher PD should include PDs on SEL, what it is, and then how to incorporate it, how to do all of the self work that needs to go into doing this type of work before you bring it in front of your students. All of that needs to be talked about. And then in the classroom, like just continuous help on how to incorporate it into lessons, not just SEL time at the beginning of the school day, but how we have this in every single period, every single day with every single teacher, how we collaborate with other teachers in the building to do this work. Like my SEL in the music room probably shouldn't look too different from SEL in the math classroom and in the ELA classroom. So time and how to work with the other teachers in our school to continue doing this work.
And Alice, as someone who's on the forefront of this, as someone who straddles academia and practitioner, how do you think about moving that forward from a pedagogical perspective?
I think what Leah said, as usual, is brilliant.
No
And I
disagreement there.
absolutely about the overhaul in music education curriculums. I will also posit that with sometimes nearly 40-45% of new teachers leaving the field within 5 years, we need SEL. I sent a precious young teacher out into the field, sweet, wonderful. And I saw a teaching video that she submitted for the next summer for a program. And it was all kinds of things that showed how frustrated she was with what was happening, and that she and the students didn't really have a relationship. And I thought immediately, we need to work on this and work on some SEL. So yes, I agree. We need to do that as teachers in the field. We need to receive that as professional development. I think students need to get it before they finish their pre-service years. And I think for all of us, I think it would really help improve teacher retention if teachers had SEL to use.
Agreed. Scott, any thoughts on your side?
Absolutely. And it's going to be the peanut butter and jelly of Alice and Leah. Alice, thanks for absolutely just kind of jumping in there on the teacher attrition thing, because this profession, eats people up and spits it out. And that makes it just so tough to keep going. I think one of my biggest mantras right now is that we need to put the what on the back burner and remind ourselves of the why. When we put our center of the why we got into this profession in the first place, oftentimes that puts the student at the center of the classroom. So the punchline of what I'm going to say, Manoj, is that what do I want the future of SEL to look like? I want it to look like a space where every single classroom puts the student at the center of the space and not the subject. I want it embedded on all levels. Of course, we need to restructure what it looks like in higher education. Oftentimes we're preparing for a better yesterday. And right now we really need to think about what our needs are to prepare and look for the needs that have changed. This pandemic has changed our fundamental needs, and we can do a better job with that. And when we focus on that why, that's what really gets at. And it's not just the student's agency. I think another reason why teachers leave the profession is because teachers feel like they don't have agency. So last thing I'm going to say is that here's a really quick model that I think can guide teachers into really feeling like they have agency around social and emotional learning. And I can't take credit, Leah, as you said, and Alice, as you said, good musicians don't borrow, we steal. And this is stolen from my very, very dear friend, Urel Lashley from UW-Madison. And he came up with the STAY model. So S stands for select. Teachers select the SEL competencies that you want to work on and that your students need. And if you don't know what your students need, ask them. Then T stands for translate. How do we translate that SEL skill for our space? How does it look in elementary general music? How does it look in high school band? A is the action. How do we implement it in our space on a day-to-day basis? And Y is youth empowerment. Select, translate, action, youth empowerment. I wish STAY was spelled YSTA because I really think that leaving Y for the end really doesn't work too well. That why needs to come first, and putting it as a bolt-on at the end, no. We need to understand that this is a process. The selecting, the translating, the action needs to be something that we do with the teachers and with the students. And if we are doing this collaboratively, believe it or not, in the end, it takes a lot of pressure off the teachers, and onward we go.
I think that's a great place to end. And I know we went a little bit over. Thank you very much to everyone for joining our first in a series of discussions. Thank you very much to our panelists, not only for your time today, but for all of your contributions to SEL and to music education. Huge applause. You all do very important work, and it needs to be sung more. And thank you also to our teachers and to our instructional supervisors for all the great work that they do as well. I'm awestruck by everything you do. I know we went a little bit over. If anyone does have any questions that we have not answered, please feel free to send me an email or to Adam or to info@etmonline.org, and we'll be happy to address them. Thank you very much.